Sir, as recording begins, yeah. A very good
Am I
evening, all.
audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
I guess my speakers are not working here.
Yes, sir, you are audible clearly.
No, is it through the laptop mic or through this device?
Through the device, I believe. We
Yes.
can hear you clearly.
All right, that should be the objective. I want to get voice across as clearly as possible. Like last time, there were some glitches, I suppose. Um, Anyways, yeah.
Yes,
So
please Ganesh.
we can begin. Very good evening to all. We are going to begin with 39th session today in our NetSet mentoring program. Today we have a session on Indian poetics by Dr. Maulik Vyas. Sir is already introduced in one of the sessions. He has dealt with translation studies in detail. And Indian poetics, as you might be knowing, is a very important aspect of literature and theory learning. Sir is a very voracious reader and researcher in the field of Indian poetics and knowledge system. So I welcome you, sir, on behalf of all the participants, Alumni Association, and the department. And I wish all the participants to have a happy learning of Indian side of theory and literature. Welcome, sir.
All right. Good evening, all of you. And I'm given this task to introduce Indian poetics to the heterogeneous club that we have right now. I'm told Indian poetics is not as such part of the formal study with many universities, right? In which case, it has to be preliminary, it has to be in real sense introductory. And to me, it was really a big deal because this task which is given to me, I remember uh, Professor Singh used to tell us that make your teacher's life hell, of course, by asking questions. And when Parth told me that you are talking about the, the panoptic survey of Indian poetic system, then I just remembered that, I mean, he is uh, not at all making it any easier for me when he said that it's like a panoptic survey of the entire 1700 years in 1 hour. So I'll try as sincerely as possible to give the glimpse of what you are supposed to know and what you are supposed to read, and how things, the lay of the things lay over there. All right. So that is the idea. Number one. Number two, uh, I would like to talk about the nature of Indian poetics as such, right? Because some of you might be pursuing it uh, right now or maybe even later for research work. So, which are the things that we keep in mind and approach this subject, right? Because students with 2 years exposure to Western theory criticism and then for the research work, they turn to Indian poetics. Then they find it like swimming against the current and feel frustrated. And what we don't appreciate, what we don't genuinely understand, we then tend to avoid because it's a human tendency to avoid pain, right? So this subject is famed for giving the uneasy moments in our study. All right. Now, uh, what I would begin with would be on the general character of this entire field of study, right? So I'll be switching from PPT to the documents wherever I need to refer to certain information, right, and want to show you that. I hope the screen is visible to you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, first and foremost, I'm using the word Sanskrit literary theory, all right, because the word Indian poetics is a very broad term. Because for that matter, you would have the Kannada language, Tamil language, Telugu. What we see here is that most of these literary theoretical concepts and the texts which exist in literary theory in India, they happen to develop from the Sanskrit knowledge system and textual tradition. So that is one reason I'm calling it Sanskrit literary theory. Secondly, I'm calling it literary theory, not critical theory. So this is a distinction that we make right from the beginning, that literary theory springs from the backdrop of concerns such as language, philosophy, aesthetics, right? Quote unquote aesthetics, because this field of aesthetics is as such. My proposition is that ancient Indian tradition did not categorically delve on aesthetics. Okay, this is my proposition number one. However, in the same breath, I would add that it is not that we have not a serious deliberations made on aesthetics. We do have, but not under that category of aesthetics. So we have concerns for language, philosophy, aesthetics, grammar, logic. Now, these are the parent domains whose concepts and principles, when we borrow for our understanding of literature, writing, and reading, then we are in the field of literary theory. By critical theory, what we should mean is it is concerned with the social and political dimensions which exist on the periphery of the literary discourse, and the conceptual tools, arguments, logic. Now, these things come from non-literary background, which you have in your psychoanalysis, Marxism, right? Dialectical materialism, post-structuralism to an extent. Now, critical theory is in nature centrifugal. It takes you away from core literature into areas which you just wonder what on earth they are, because we are not technically trained in social science, we are not technically trained in psychology, and we are not technically trained in historiography. All right, so it is more befuddling over there. Now, as a science, as a systematic study, literary theory and critical theory both try to make sense of literary writing, but their approaches are centrifugal and centripetal. All right. Literary theory springs from these domains such as grammar, logic, philosophy of language, aesthetics. Now, these are the building blocks of literary writing. All right, these are the building blocks. So you are not far away from the actual concerns. So in that light, Sanskrit literary theory puts forward some basic fundamental questions. So how is kavya? And kavya is a generic term. Kavya is not only a poem or poetry in terms of genre, but both visual and oral. So how is it constituted? What is the most important element for the literariness of kavya? Now, all our different schools of Indian poetics, Sanskrit literary theory, they are debating over this question. They have devoted much of their bulk of discussion on this question. Then how is literary meaning determined? How should verbal import be received? Now, it is part of grammar, right from the Vedic writings to the Paurushaya texts. Apaurusha and Paurusha. Apaurusha means these are as such not authored by the individuals to whom you attribute authorship, right? So these texts are called Apaurusha, and all these texts which can be ascribed to an individual under certain authorship that you call Paurushaya. Now, in both these modes of writing, this question of generating meaning and how the verbal import, the meaning, the verbal meaning should be received. Now, it is discussed at length. What is the end of literary representation? Now, this question lends you into the aesthetic concerns. What is the nature of literary meaning? If you consider this, what is the end of literary representation and the nature of literary meaning, then you are with the questions that once Plato busied himself with. That how are we supposed to process a literary statement from as distinct from a factual statement, right? Or are we to confuse them together? For example, I often tell my engineering students one example, that I show to you my picture and ask you, how do I look in this picture, in this photograph? And if you tell me, sir, the frame is nice, what is the meaning? Most of my students in engineering college fail to grasp the intended meaning that I want to cull out from this. When I ask, how do I look in the photograph? And you say the frame is nice. The statement is frame is nice.
Sir,
But,
just
yeah.
excuse me. It is still the first slide on the screen. You have
Yeah.
not, yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm
Okay.
continuing with these questions.
Okay, sir.
All right.
So, sir, if you could please start.
Linguistically speaking, yes, please.
Sir, if you could just start the slideshow so that the slide gets magnified a little.
Is it not slideshow?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sir. You can click on from beginning. Yeah. Yeah.
Visible?
We can see the second slide now.
All right, I am with the second slide.
All right, yeah. Thank you, sir.
All right. All right. So the point is that students over here miss the implicature. Now, implicature is negative implication. All right. So when somebody states in an affirmative statement, but the intended meaning is in negation, that is called implicature. Now, students in engineering are not trained to process such a statement semantically, so they will simply miss what is the intended meaning. All right. So how to receive the meaning which exists at number of levels like literal, connotative, suggestive, referential. So what is the nature of literary meaning? All right. So this is one major concern with Sanskrit literary theory. Then nature of art experience. As I said, I am not using the term aesthetics. A reason is that in the West, aesthetics is a specific branch of philosophy. Now in India, philosophy, there is no term for philosophy, but we call anvikshaki, which is logic, and the broader version of that is darshana. So literally we translate it as demonstrations, but the word darshana is now retained and it is accepted in English usage. So art experience, what is the nature of art experience? Is it particularly delimited, controlled, and characterized by the human experience within this physical world, or it transports you to some such world where you conceive, you experience, you feel, and all of this is of different character and nature. The term that they use is alokik. Do you have an alokik experience over there? All right, so this question is taken up by Kavya Prakash, writer, and Abhinav Bharti, writer. And the locus of art experience. Now, the Ras Mimamsa, the Ras critics have developed a serious debate, particularly on this question. Where is the locus? Where is the point of origin of art experience? Where does it reside primarily? And what are the criteria for classification? Taxonomy part, well, I'll just show you a couple of models for literary classification. Now, there was one, R.B. Patankar once levied a charge against literary theory in India that we don't have the concept of literary taxonomy, which is errantly misbegotten and half-baked. Right, we'll just see in time that this field is sufficiently explored. So when we're dealing with a literary theory in Sanskrit, unlike the Western counterpart, it is evidence-based analysis. So if you read Rudrata, Bhama, Natya Shastras, their principles, their theorizations, all of these do not exist in vacuum. So if, for example, Raj Shekhar in 10th century gives you types of poets, Kavya Kavi, Arth Kavi, Roop Kavi, Vyangya Kavi, so he just doesn't structure his argument and classify the types of poets for the sake of fancy. Now, for his each proposition, he will furnish an example. All right. So in Indian literary theory, what we see is that your theorization is always supported by the evidences, by the examples. And Raj Shekhar's Kavya Mimamsa is a treasure trove for so many references that it has more than 610 different types of examples from the different shastras, technical treatises, and literary texts. All right. So look at the range of referencing that he provides in his text. Secondly, precise content and logical stand. Now, for example, you read Bhama's Kavyalankar, so his introduction lasts only for, say, 6 to 7 shlokas. You read Kavyadarsh by Dandi, he spares up, to be specific, 9 shlokas for introduction. That's it. And he will directly come to the content. So this is something that you see in our mode of writing at present. We are very discursive. Our introduction runs for 20, 30, 40 pages. In fact, even our abstract, when you write a research paper, our abstracts are like 2 paragraphs. Some other day I was telling Parth or somebody else the example of John Nash, the mathematician who got the Nobel Prize for his game theory. Now, for his PhD, his abstract was running only for 2 to 3 lines. That is it. So, the precision, the brevity is called a virtue in Sanskrit poetics. And they say that there is this saying that if you save a word in your statement, then the writer has the joy as if he got blessed with the sun, right? So that joy of just saving one word, 1 or 2 word in a line, is superlatively compared with the birth of a son. All right. Now it is in nature metacritical. So it is criticism on criticism oftentimes. The entire tradition is cumulative, eclectic, dialectical, furiously dialectical, I would say, because just because Abhinav Gupta says so or Anand Vardhan says so, however big they may be, it will not stop Mahim Bhatt from debunking the entire Dhwani theory. All right. So it is pretty dialectical and a continuous knowledge tradition. So even today, lots of writers have been writing and researching. It is characterized by Tika Parampara. Now it is something unique which does not exist in any other tradition of literary traditions of the world. It is commentaries. So if somebody writes a book, right, for example, Bharata's Natya Shastra is there, so Abhinav Gupta would write Abhinav Bharati, or Dhvanyalok is there, so the commentary would be Lochan, and there are many more commentaries. After 13th century, the commentary age, the yug of Tika writing, flourishes more. Now, Tika text can be seen as an extension of the original text, because sometimes the commentator expands and continues the argument of the writer and then adds something more to it. For example, Abhinav Gupta, while talking about Ras, now he talks about the impersonalization of Ras, accepts the posit of Bhatt Nayak that there is this Sadharanikaran, but rejects his claim for Bhavakatva and Bhojakatva and accepts the Dhvani argument, and then goes into a Shaivite discoursal arguments that the Chamatkruti of Ras is akin to Prakash and Vimarsh, that this is an alokik, non-worldly stasis, joy. Now, it is something that Bharat never meant in the first place in his Natya Shastra, but Abhinav Gupta is extending his argument. Likewise, the commentators, they develop on the actual text, so they become the tika text, become the co-text. So the practice is that when you read a text, you also pick up the relevant tika of that text. Then it is structured composition and reading. The Sanskrit Shastric text has a robust structure. It is not haphazardly composed. All right. In simple parlance, if you say that chapterization is very forethoughtful, like it would have hetu, the objective, pratigna, that is hypothesis, purva paksha, that is your antecedent view. Now, antecedent view is that you consider the views of your opponent, the adversarial views that you want to refute, or the contesting claims. Then Uttar Paksh, your hypothesis explained. Uttar Paksh is your hypothesis explained, followed by Udaharan. That is that, as I said earlier, it is an evidence-based analysis. So Udaharan has to be there. You have to give an example. Just woolly theoretical talk will not do. There has to be some concrete evidence to back up your argument. Then, after having followed the stages, you reach Nirnay. Nirnay is your conclusion, and when it is proven to be sound, when it is not internally conflicted, and it is supported by other thinkers and critics, then later it may become a Siddhant, like Rasa Sutra. All right, so Rasa Sutra operates as a Siddhant because in a prolonged tradition, number of critics and scholars have tested it, argued about it, and then proven its mechanism. So Siddhant comes at the end. So Siddhant would be theory. All right. Again, do not confuse Siddhant just directly with theory, because in the West, theories are often self-contradictory. They keep on evolving. One person comes and gives one theory. Just in modernism, you might have seen that every other writer has one's own theory of writing, be it Eliot, Joyce, Woolf. They have their own theory. So we will not call them Siddhant, because it will not be qualified as a Siddhant. It has to be tested, agreed upon, examined, thoroughly examined by a number of people, and then it has to be brought about. These are major schools. Apart from these major schools, now in your NET exam, you can expect the canonical questions on Rasa, Alankar, Gunadosh, Riti, Auchitya, Vakrokti, Dhvani.
Sir, the slide is still the same, the second one.
Is it? I have moved.
Yes, sir.
I have moved on to third and fourth slide.
So yes, it is still the second one, sir.
Can you see this?
Not yet, sir.
This is third slide.
No, but your screen is not visible as yet, sir.
Screen is not visible.
No, not yet.
Okay, is this visible?
No, sir.
I have stop the slideshow, and now I am with the PPT document itself.
Okay.
Is this visible?
No, sir. Your screen is still not shared.
Wait.
Hmm. Yes, now it is visible. Major schools.
Okay, is this visible?
Yes, sir. Now the fourth slide on major schools is there on our screen.
All right, all right. So for the NET exam, you can expect the canonical fields Ras, Alankar, Gondosh, Riti, Auchitya, and Dhvani. However, there are all of these schools, in all of these schools, these allied concerns exist. So be it Bhama, Dandi, Udbhat, Rudrat, Rajshekhar, Mammat, all of them would be dealing with literary taxonomy. All of them would be talking about practical criticism or the questions of Arth Nirdharana. Now, Arth Nirdharana is how do we determine a meaning? Through which process? Either through inference or through the grammatical mechanism, whether it is Abhida, Lakshana, Vyanjana. Abhida is your literal meaning, Lakshana is secondary, Vyanjana, the Vyanjakatva third category is introduced by Anandvardhan, which is suggestivity. Some grammarians also hold the fourth category of Tatparya as a meaning, as an intended meaning. All right. Now, through which mode are we going to determine Arth Nirdharana? Now, the earliest extant text on Arth Nirdharana we have in the form of Patanjali's grammar, Panini's grammar, and Yask, the philosopher critic called Yask. His text is Nirukta, which is on etymology. So they are concerned with Arth Nirdharana because in the Vedic discourse, Arth Nirdharana is something crucial because sometimes it uses twilight language, symbolic language. The reason is that the past masters realized that the language that we use, the human iteration, has limitation. Limitation caused by the sensory nature of the world and our cognition of the world. So we cognize the world through our five senses, and our five senses have certain limitations. So our cognition is inherently controlled by our sense perception. Now, there are then topics, ideas, concepts which are abstract, which are mathematical, which are spiritual in nature. So when we want to talk about them, then our language, which is at best sufficient for indicating the tangible reality, might turn inadequate. All right. So to bypass this problem, they have heavily introduced the textual symbolism in this text. All right. So we need the particular kind of linguistic training to understand what mode of sentence is this. That is where Arth Nirdharan. Discourse ecology, where Sutra, Chand, Karika, Shlok, Paddhati. Now, Paddhati is a gloss, Panjika is the difficult words annotated, Tika is commentary, Bhashya is the elaborate explanation of the difficult concept, and Vimansa is logical analysis. Now, your text could be a Paddhati, it could be a Panjika, it could be a Tika. You may be writing it in a Sutra, Chand. I am calling it Chanda, not exactly prosodic, all right, because Chanda has its very long history. It dates back to the Vedic writing, and most of them are oral in nature. So there is this Path Parampara where you have different modes of recital. So there could be one shlok, for example, Gayatri Mantra is there. So you can recite in Sanhita Path, Gan Path, Dhwaj Path, Krama Path. There are different path. So mantra could be one, but there are different recital modes. So the rules which govern the modes of recital, the mathematical precision that is working in each of these different modes of recital, these are part of chandas as such. All right. Later, when the literary texts are being written, then you have a huge number of different meters, what we understand as poetic meters, being discussed over there. Karika is a memorial verse, right? It is easy, something that is easy to remember, right? Now, shlok usually is in Arya meter. Okay. Kalidas onwards, you know, the Vedic discourse is not written in shlok. Please remember that. It is in richas. And agamas, the texts which are parallelly existing to the Vedic discourse, the agamic discourse, such as you have a Shiv Sutra, you have Paritrimshika Vivaran, you have Pratyabhigna Hridayam Sutra. These are agamic texts. Okay, so they are written in sutras. The Vedas have richas, the Agamas have sutras, right? When you come to the descriptive poems that we call itihas, like Mahabharata and Ramayana onwards, you see the proliferation of the use of shloka because it gives a lot of flexibility to the writer. The question of Shabda Shakti, which is discussed in grammar, and the text of logic. The logic is primarily the school known as Nyaya and Vaisheshika. Okay, so there the concept of word as a cognitive tool is discussed, and Shabda Shakti is properly examined and at length discussed by Bhartrihari in his Vakyapadiya. Kavi Vyapar, Kavi Karma, and Kavi Shiksha. These are another allied concerns which exist. Kavi Vyapar is poetic process, something whose parallel you find in Coleridge or Longinus. Kavi Karma, poetic genius, the nature of poetic talent, right? Something that you find in T.S. Eliot. Training the poets. Now, this is something that you do not find as such, professionally speaking, in the West. Anyways, recently there is this mode of writing called how to do. How to do. There is this genre, like how to become an engineer, how to become doctor, how to fix a chair. So this is something like this: how to become a poet, how to write poems. So training the poets is the subject of Kavi Shiksha. And Rajashekhar is one with Kavya Mimamsa, and there is another text called Kavi Kanthavarana, okay, which is on this subject. Now, for you to just go through, you have this major schools: Ras, Alankar, Gundosh, Riti, Dhwani, Vakrukti, and Auchitya. So for your net purpose, what you need to know primarily is about Natya Shastra by Bharat, Dashrupak, then coming down to Bhama, Kavyalankar, Dandi's Kavyadarsh, Then Vaman's Kavalankar Sutra, which is on Riti, Vakrokti, Kuntakas, and Kshamindra's Auchitya Vichar.
Sir, again
Apart from this,
if you have moved on, we are still on the 4th slide on our screen.
oh, now somehow it stops sharing.
Yes, now it is
I am
visible,
really
sir.
on the next slide. Just
Yes.
wait. Is this visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this major Sangraha text. Now, Sangraha text, they are called digest, just like you have Reader's Digest. So over here, they are not concerned with one dominant thematic idea, but they are including all other allied theoretical concerns. So you have Rajshekhar's text, the King Bhoj. His text is Saraswati Kantabharan. Then Shringar Prakash, Mammata's text in 11th century, Kavya Prakash. Vishwanath's text Sahitya Darpan, and Jagannath's text Rasa Gangadhar. It is an incomplete text, but it has survived down the line of history and it is available to us in its incomplete form. I am moving on to next slide. Prasthana. Is it visible?
No, sir.
Not visible.
No, we are still on the 5th slide. Yes, now it is. Prasthan, yes.
I think because of the net issue, it is little slow. Couple of.
Yeah. Yes, it might be, sir.
Now, Prasthan means that as a student of Indian poetics, as a researcher of Indian poetics, you are supposed to be conversant, you are supposed to be well versed with at least one or two of this. Grammar, number one. Now, grammar is very important because in India, the only person who is called philosopher is a grammarian. Grammar has a serious prestige. Grammarian holds a serious prestige in Indian knowledge system. So Vyakaran, Chandas and Path, Nirvachan, that is etymology, schools of Darshana. So you have Sankhya, Yog, Vaisheshik, Nyay, Vishishtadvait, Trik or Kashed, or the other word is Kashmir Shaivism. Now, there are about 16 different major schools. Madhvacharya's Saradarshana Sangrah is a text on all these schools. Praman Vidya, theory of valid cognition. Now, R.V. Pathak, from you might have heard this name in Gujarat. He worked in Gujarat Vidyapith. R.V. Pathak as a short story writer, and apart from that, as a critic. Actually, before he was a literary person, before he was a writer or a critic, he was a trained epistemologist. He was trained in Pramana Shastra. Okay. And then when he looks at Indian poetics, so a lot of his concepts, his terms, his arguments, they come from the background of Pramana Vidya. And on this ground, he refutes Anand Vardhana's claim and upholds Mahim Bhatta's claim that even the act of suggestion is but a variant of the human faculty of inference, because you just can't run away by saying that, oh, this is nothing but poetic suggestion. But the question is, how does a human brain grasp the suggestion? What is the psychoneurotic process of understanding suggestion? What exactly happens when you come to the suggested sense? Now, when you are concerned with this, you are exactly in the field of darshana or philosophy or valid cognition. Cognition means bodh. So, सत्य का बोध, सत्य बोध, जगत का सत्य बोध कैसे हो? Because our human perception has fundamental physical limitation to understanding and knowing the reality. So how to ascertain that what you know is valid? So see, we are not talking about good or bad, right or wrong. We are talking about valid, what holds, what can be verified empirically. That is called valid. So R.V. Pathak, as an epistemologist, looks at the entire rasa mimansa, rasa criticism from the viewpoint of Nyaya Praman Vidya. And then this causal theories. So Satkaryavad is that you have cause and effect understood as one. Asatkaryavad is that you understand cause and effect differently. Parinamvad is that the teleological nature where the end justifies the cause, that cause is determined and defined based on the result. Vivartavad is the Vedantic understanding of causality where the end, the result is apparent, not in its essential existential form. Abhaswad is the Kashmir Shaivite take, where the reality is understood by us as concrete. However, we have its impression, and that impression is qualified by many other mental factors. So what we know as reality is but a version of our own uh, understanding of the impressions. So we are farther removed from the understanding. Syadvad is maybeism in the Jaina philosophy, where number of probabilities are accepted and included. Apohavad is in a way nihilistic. I would use the word nihilism in very limited sense, but that it refutes the the probabilities so that you come close to one particular meaning. This is a deferral of meaning. In fact, in your post-structuralism, when you are talking about the concept of deference, that when you determine a meaning, you hold other meanings postponed. Now, that is a theoretical extension of Apohavad. And Hetvabhas, these are some fallacies in the objectives. I'm moving on to next slide. Now, when we come to Bhama Kavyalankar text, he gives us the classification of types of literary writing. So this is Bhama's generic model. And over here, he discusses the parameters on which basis one can classify. So these parameters could be medium. Your medium could be prose or poetry, then language, subject matter. Subject matter can be factual, imaginative, based on art and craft or technical treatise, and classification based on composition, whether you have.
Sir, sorry again, but the slide has not changed. Yes, now it has.
Okay. And this composition classification is based whether it is on Sargabadh or abhinaya, that is enacted, akhyayika, which is in first person narration, or it is katha, third person narration, or it is unconnected, disjointed works like you have gathas. So this is one model where the literary classification is forwarded by Bhamaha. I will not go much into it because we have 10 other different models. You can look at this Agni Purana's model. Agni Puran is an interesting text. Is this visible?
Yes, sir.
Where about 11 chapters are dedicated just to the topic of poetics. So literary discourse or Vangmai is classified and discussed from the perspective of oral and visual. Okay, this will remind you the text of Aristotle Poetics, where he classifies literary discourse. Moving on to the next slide. In the Guna doctrine, you have two major proponents, Dandi and Udbhat. And in Guna, majorly 10 gunas are enlisted and upheld by most of these theorists. First is Shlesh. Shlesh is like, packing up too many ideas and meanings in a small expression. So that is the essential meaning of Shlesh. So it is polysemic in nature. So if your expression has polysemy, so it is the merit called Shlesh. Now what happens is that over here in this, by the time of 8th century, Dandi and Udbhat, they hold that for literary composition, putting premium on guna, literary merits, it is of utmost significance, because it is only these properties of guna which distinguish literary writing from the factual or technical writing. So for them, this discourse of guna is very important. That is why they are theorizing on this. Prasad, Samata, Madhurya. Now, what are these gunas? They are actually the descriptive categories for our stylistic analysis. So if you are engaging with a stylistic analysis and you process a statement, that how does a sentence or a statement read? So does it read with flow? Does it read with description? Does it read with complexity? Now, these are then stylistic markers. These gunas are stylistic markers. And Dandi in his Pariched number 3 discusses the demerits. Now let me also discuss the word Pariched. In Kavyadarsha, it's a name of a chapter. Pariched means even Bhama's Kavyalankar has Pariched 1, 2, 3. Pariched means a chapter which can be read non-linearly. So you don't have to read in the sequence like chapter 1, then you read chapter 2. No. Over here, you can pick up any text in whichever number and sequence you want. So when you organize your text in that manner, your chapter would be called Pariched. So in this third Pariched, he says that you avoid logical errors, linguistic errors, referential and expressional errors. Now, for a writer, these are the guidelines for the writers to take care of. So 7th century, by the time of 7th century, Bhamaha is talking about literary classification, the nature of literature, and the essential rhetorical devices. After this, next century comes Dandi, and he talks about the guna, dosh, and alankaras in a different light from what Bhama had discussed. Okay. Now, for example, Bhama considered Swabhavokti as a basis statement against which Vakrokti is to be understood as an alankar. Vakrokti, remember that Vakrokti is an alankar in Bhama. But Dandi says that Swabhavokti equally holds a claim to be called an alankar because it is a basic explanatory statement that exists at all the levels in all the discourses, and as a writer you cannot do away without Swabhavokti. And how to polish and work on Swabhavokti so well that even your statement, which is referential, which is factual, and yet it is delightful, how to work on that in that way is a concern for Dandi. Right. Moving on to next. By the time we reach Vakrokti, Kuntaka's time, sufficient argument has been made on the rhetorical devices and the literary faults and literary merits. But Kuntak develops the element of Vakrokti into a separate and distinct tenet, a literary tenet which can stand on its own right. So he defines that a poem is with Shabda and Arth, but it is Vakra Kavi Vyapara Shalini, that there is this artistic turn of speech, that the poet defamiliarizes the combination of word and meaning. And some of you must be knowing that often Vakrokti and Russian formalism, they are comparatively studied because they are very close in their propositions. They share this affinity. And it says Bande Vyavasthito Kavetat Ahlad Karine, that the compositional rigor is so well that that poem produces an aesthetic relish. And over here he talks about 6 major places where the writer can introduce the obliquity. Now this obliquity means crooked way of saying something. You distort the normal way of plain statement so that you defamiliarize the referent, you defamiliarize the idea. And if you want to do that, there are 6 probabilities, there are 6 avenues. This obliquity could be introduced at the syllabic level,
Sir,
or at the base
if I may interrupt,
substantive. Yeah, please.
sir, we are getting a lot of messages from the participants that they want a separate session, a detailed session on Vakrokti and the schools that are remaining. So they are asking for a second part of Indian poetics. If you agree that instead of winding it up in 10 minutes, you would like to take another session, then we can open this session for question answer, and we can have the continuation of this session, because I as well as the participants see that there are things remaining to be discussed, substantial things remaining to be discussed. So this is a request from the participants.
All
I'm
right.
forwarding it to you, sir.
Yeah, I understand. This time we had a lot of glitch in the presentation part. But before all right, we'll stop here. But before I do that, let me share with you the
Yes.
major books to be read. All right.
Yes.
Um, uh, Pardon me, I am not very familiar with the Google platform because we are into Microsoft.
That's all right, sir. We have Dr. Dhwani Vaishnav to help
So
you.
just a minute. Okay, this is the, I hope you see this.
Uh,
Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
yes, yes, visible now.
Okay. So
Source text.
this is all beginning with the 2nd century BC, that is before Common Era. Now it is called Common Era. It is not AD and BC. Before Common Era and Common Era. So 2nd century BC to 2nd century Common Era. Natya Shastra beginning from there to these are major text. Now you can expect these questions from like who wrote what, this could be one question. These are famous translators in the right hand side last column. Some of the names that I could conjure. And if you are looking forward to reading the modern scholars, these were the earlier were the source texts. Now A.B. Keith, Kumar Swami, Avdesh Kumar Singh, Betty Hyman, uh, Professor Kapil Kapoor, Literary Theory and Indian Conceptual Framework. This one, I guess it is out of print, but if you get chance to look into it, it would be great. K.C. Pandey. Now this one, Raniero Noli and K.C. Pandey, they are exclusive scholars on Abhinavgupta. They have devoted their entire lifetime to the study of Abhinavgupta. And Raniero Noli is from Rome, Italian. He is considered an authority on the works of Abhinavgupta. All right. So these are important texts on the Indian poetics. Okay.
All right, Dhwani madam, you can
Well,
ask sir to conclude on the condition that he will definitely agree for a second part of this session, taking into consideration
Yes.
the personal WhatsApp requests from the participants. Please.
Yes.
Well, I first
Okay.
sincerely apologize. This time there was some glitch with the presentation. Somehow we were not able to have the smooth screen sharing. I don't know what happened this time. Last time it wasn't the case, or
I
which we
believe that
lost
was because of,
substantial time, I guess.
but I believe that was because of network connectivity.
Probably, yes.
Because I see sometimes my voice as I speak, it is being echoed at your end, sir. So maybe like that gap.
Hmm.
Yes, dear participants, then in that case, from today's session, if we have any observations, questions, comments, any sharing, we would discuss with Dr. Vyas and let you know if and when sir can give us another date. There was no issue. Yeah. Any
We
any
have to,
question?
if that is the case, if we can put it at the fag end of the program, because then
Right, sir.
because there are a couple of things at hand
So
right now to
certainly,
We
certainly.
need
two
to
translation
elaborate.
projects
Yes.
are going on. But yes, for the researchers, uh, if only if I can share, if you give me 1 minute, I want to share one particular uh, window.
Please, sir. Please.
Roadblocks. No, not here. Yes. Most of the
Yes, it is
students,
visible, sir.
researchers, all right, most of the people find difficulties in dealing with Sanskrit poetics. And the reason is, number one, we have limited understanding of Sanskrit. Number two, we rely on translation, and many a time the translated texts are inadequate. For example, once I was looking into S.L. Bilwalkar's translation of Dandi's Kavadarsh, and Dandi referred to a language called Paishachi. So you have Prakrit, Apabhransh, and Paishachi. And our dear gentleman translator is translating Paishachi language as the ghost language. Now that was utter foolish and stupid translation, you know. Or for that matter, even Manomohan Ghosh, in his translation of Natya Shastra, while talking about the Sanchari Bhavas, when he enumerates 33 Sanchari Bhavas, so there is this one transitory state of expression called Maran. Now he translates it as death. Now death is not transitory, you know, when it comes, it is final, and that is our final exit. So death is not the transitory state, but dying is. So when an actor is doing the acting on the stage, the actor does not really die. The actor is merely enacting for some time being, and that acting is of dying. All right. So then these are some translatorial issues. Like there are certain untranslatables or some terminologies which are difficult to translate into English, because then there is no one-to-one correspondence found in English culture, language, their way of life, their philosophy. It is simply not there. So these are some issues that when we are dealing with Indian poetics, and we read them with our habit of reading Western literary theory and criticism, and we approach headlong, then there would be some confusion. There would be some problem in our understanding and clarity. And yes, context-free application of poetical concepts. So this is, I would say, it is, you know, Le Bhagu Vidya. You have understood Dhwani, for example, Avivakshit Vachya and Vivakshitanya par Vachya. Is this slide visible?
Yes, sir.
Hello? All right. Now, Avivakshit Vachya means when the primary meaning of the word is completely abandoned and you are directly processing the suggested sense through secondary sense. For example, you have this statement, tiger, tiger, burning bright. Now, tiger cannot be burning bright. So your mind tells you that this is not the meaning of tiger. So your first meaning is completely abandoned. Now you are looking for something else. So this is example of avivakshit vachya. Vivakshit vachya Vivakshitanya par vachya, abhida mool. Now it is when the first sense is not discarded, but the second one is adopted. For example, Robert Frost's poem, fences make good neighbors. So in your mind, there is this concept of fence. Fence as a tangible object, material object. It exists, and you can imagine, you can see the picture in your mind. And when you say fences make good neighbors, now you can process the second meaning apart from the first meaning. All right. So point is that when we are studying Sanskrit poetics and we do context-free application, like we identify Vivakshitanya Parvacha in one category, or we identify Karuna Ras in one line, it is not how it works. So there is no context-free application of poetical concepts. I hope I'm making some sense over here. We just can't identify one line and say, oh, here is Vakrokti, or here is Pani, or here is Ras. It doesn't work like that. It is, many people do this. Most of our research scholars are busy identifying the parallels, but at worst, it is nothing but a vulgar practice. We are wasting our time. Please understand that you have to look at the theory in its proper framework before you apply to a particular text, right? Just selective application of certain tenets of dhvani or ras will not hold, and negligence to corresponding internal external evidence. That is, that we do not have the historical understanding of our 6th, 7th, 8th century. We know about the Renaissance, Victorian time, the Great War, that is World War I, World War II, but we have no idea what happened, what transpired in 6th century, 7th century, or when the Vijayanagar Samraj, the empire, this Vijayanagar Samrajya was flourishing. So you have this Pratap Rudriya text coming up, or you have the Ras Gangadhar writing in the north. So we don't know our history. All right. So these are some stumbling blocks that makes the ordeal even greater. Well, this is what I wanted to share. Yes. Anything else?
Okay. Yeah. Participants, if we have any questions, observations, suggestions from today's session, as we just mentioned, we will discuss with sir a suitable date from him, and then we will post it in our WhatsApp group and on our schedule. For today, if we have any query, questions are welcome.
See, I would be really happy if you have something to ask or suggest. It is not
Sir,
that
we have
because
one
I'm on
question.
this side. So any suggestion or observation is equally welcome.
Yeah, sir, we have one question from Dr. Chirag Aditya.
Right. Yes, Chirag.
He says, would you throw light on the word vyutpatti, which is one of the factors needed in the process of poetic creation besides pratibha and abhyas?
Okay. Rajshekhar says Bahugyata Vyutpatti. The general meaning of Vyutpatti is etymology. All right. Etymology is the root of the meaning of word, or how the word over time evolved in meaning. Likewise, when you extend the meaning of Vyutpatti, then it is the source or the origin of the know-how that the writer, the poet has. Like, how many things does a poet know about? how many different fields of study does a poet know about? That we call Vyutpatti. So that's why he says Bahugyata Vyutpatti. Bahugyata means for him that person is a poet who knows many things. And by many things, it is indicating at intellectual polyglottism. You know, intellectual polyglottism means that you know about your food, you know about your people, you know about their dress, costume habits, you know about their linguistic habits, speech habits, you know about different literary styles, you know about the different places. This reminds me that there is one essay by Rainer Maria Rilke, if you can lay a hand on that, where he says that a good poet should be a traveler. Why? Because through traveling, you come to know many things. And a poet must have a lot of input before he sits down to give some output. So Vyutpatti is in this context that the poet is knower of many things. There is this intellectual polyglottism. Polyglot is a person who knows many languages, you know, more than two languages. That we call polyglot. So intellectual polyglottism is when a person knows lot many other fields, not just literature, but history, science, anything under the sky.
Right. We have another question, sir. The participant asks, can you please suggest some text in English language that accommodates basic concepts of Sanskrit poetics?
Okay, just wait. That is exactly what I shared, as a window where these texts are there. And if you have pen and paper ready, please note down. I hope this screen is visible.
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay. From Abby Keith, the important book is History of Sanskrit Literature, number 1. From A.K. Kumaraswamy, Anand Kentesh Kumar Swamy, this one, Figure of Speech or Figures of Thought, a traditional view of art. And there is this Dance of Shiva. It is an interesting text. It is on aesthetics. Professor Singh's Indian Knowledge System. Betty Hyman. She was German who worked in Sri Lanka. Then it was Ceylon University. This one is indeed a good book. I have read it when I was in Masters. Assets of Indian Thoughts. It is an excellent book. You come to Professor Kapil Kapoor. This book, Literary Theory, Indian Conceptual Framework. It is an excellent book, as I mentioned earlier, but it is out of print. So if you get a copy, I guess there is one copy, there was one Xerox copy with the Department of English, Rajkot. You can ask Professor Mehta, he might have one copy. Then K.C. Pandey, Abhinav Gupta, and Historical and Philosophical Study. Now it is, I would say, alpha and omega. Earlier I said there is this Raniero Nolli, another great scholar on Abhinav Gupta. But the thing is that he did not write in English. He did not translate it in English originally. So he translated Tantra Lok. Abhinav Gupta is famous. Abhinav Gupta is not the real name of the person. After he took Diksha under the Kol school of Tantra, he was a Shaivite Tantric, a sage, a scholar. After that, his master gives him the name Abhinav Gupta. And his major work in Indian philosophy, it is called Tantra Lok, which runs into 14 volumes. And the entire set is available for about 10 to 11,000 rupees. It is very costly. It is a huge work. Now, Raniero Noli is the only person in the West who has translated this book. But it is still heavy. You go to K.C. Pandey, Kanti Chandra Pandey, Abhinav Gupta, an historical and philosophical study. It's a voluminous book running into some 500, 600 pages, but it will explain most of the things that we are supposed to know about Abhinav Gupta. K. Krishnamurti is a translator scholar. Now, he has translated Dhvanyalok, Lochan, Vakrokti, Jivit, and in all his prefatory notes are excellent. K. Krishnamurti's. So you get a lot of information about separate schools. Of course, P.V. Kane, famous among the students of Indian poetics, history of Sanskrit poetics. For little more advanced version of Ras system, Ras Mimansa, you have M. Hiriyan. And if you want to read this text, ask Parth Joshi. He has the text. In fact, he had given me the e-copy. As I said, R.V. Pathak launches an attack on the Dhwani school on the basis of Nyay epistemology in this article, Mammatni Ras Mimansa. It is an interesting essay. V. Raghavan has written more than 120 books. He is a great scholar. He was a great scholar. You pick up any book by V. Raghavan. But some studies on some concepts of Alankar Shastra and the concept of the beautiful in Sanskrit literature. These first two, I put it on this list. They are the first ones. They are important. Otherwise, all the texts by V. Raghavan. See, it is a prodigious long history, and each scholar is discussing about each school or tenet or critic. So it is like, today, my session on this was like, if you ask me to speak on Western criticism in 1 hour, where you begin with Plato and go down up to Derrida. So that would be about some 1200 years, 11 to 1200 years. Likewise, Indian poetics, we have beginning from Bharat Muni to Pandit Jagannath, which gives us roughly about 1700 years time. So a lot of things have been written, a lot of critics have spoken, many important schools have emerged, and we can pick up one by one the central text. You go to the source text and then complement that reading with the modern critics, and that would help. Anything else? Hello?
Sir, I think we have one last question
Yeah.
for the day. It is from Nitin Pichadia. He wants to ask about existential concern in Indian philosophical system.
Can you be a little more specific? Can you help me with some more on this question? It is very broad
Nitin,
question.
yeah, Nitin is here in
Yes,
the
sir.
meeting.
Yes,
Nitin,
yes, sir.
Yeah, can you please?
So,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, wanted to know that uh, do we have existential philosophical branch as in the West we can find, or
Yeah.
if we don't have, then have we any concern with existentialism in other manner in Indian
All
philosophical
right.
system?
Yeah. Got it. Right. It is an interesting take. Um, it is not that Nitin is asking this question here for the first time. Many people, even earlier, have cruised through this idea. Now, if you look at existentialism in the West, so you have people like Sartre, you have uh, Kierkegaard, and you have the Antichrist who wrote, Array, Ecce Homo. That is the birth of tragedy. Array, Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, these are the existentialists. All right. Again, in the West, all these existentialists are not homogeneous group. For example, Kierkegaard is pretty much theistic. He subscribes to the Christian tenets when he talks about the morality, because in existentialism, if there is no God, if there is no one abstract center holding your life and giving meaning to your life, your existence, and not promising you hereafter, then what? No, that is the question in the existentialism. Now, if Kierkegaard turns theistic, Friedrich Nietzsche, turns totally atheistic. He is completely atheistic. He is not at all theistic. In fact, in his Antichrist, it is very interesting book. You should read Ecce Homo, Eccehomo. In this book, he puts some fundamental questions, some 10 to 11 questions, and to date, these questions have not been officially countered by the Vatican Church, even today. No, he has fundamental problem with the Semitic concept of the human morality, the human ethics, and he says that Christianity teaches the slave's morality. Christianity teaches the slave's morality, because by being a Christian, you cannot be asking fundamental questions of the nature of life, the origin of the universe, and what will happen uh, after I'm gone, because then there is no way to ensure after I'm gone. All right. So he raises some fundamental questions about the belief. Now, if you come to the Indian situation, then in Indian situation, as such, there hasn't been any intellectual crisis as it was felt in the West to come to such an extreme position where you discard the transcendental values and come to the social values. All the existential philosophers are putting premium on individual and social values, because theological values are no more there. Whereas over here, it has not been a felt necessity Now, even in Buddhism, when you do not believe in Vedas, you can still be going after your self-liberation. So in India, in the Indian context, Nastik is not one who does not believe in God. Nastik is one who does not believe in the authority of Veda. So Jaina is Nastik, Buddhists are Nastik, Charvak are Nastik, but they still try to find out the means to put an end to this cycle of birth. And then they have their own means of self-realization, and that is primarily through the meditation. So it is integrally and fundamentally accepted, whether you are a Jain or Buddhist or Charvak or Vedanti, the practice of meditation is very much empirical. Because you can do your Shambhavi mudra, you can do your Unmani mudra, and just in 5 seconds, 10 seconds, your cortisol and adrenaline stress hormones will go down. Your limbic system will perform. Your paranervous sympathetic system will relax. So these are pretty much empirical. You don't have to believe. See, if I feel good about my health, I don't have to believe that I am healthy. I can just feel my health. It is very much empirical. So Indian darshanas are all empirical. And likewise, they also want to realize godhood or divinity empirically, not just because it is written in the text or somebody tells me that there is this God, I will not believe. Believing will not lead me anywhere. But I want to experience divinity. I want to experience the higher dimensions of consciousness. So all these schools have their own methods, their own systems of logic. So that crisis was never felt as it was felt in the West. Because in the West, in Semitism, for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, either you can be a believer or you can be a non-believer. There is no place for agnosticism. You can't be a believing a Muslim or Christian and yet be questioning the Aqidah. You can't question the Tawheed. You can't question the Nicene Creed in Christianity. You can't question the canon of Torah in Judaism. You have to believe. So if your science tells you something else which is not conforming to your set of tenets of belief, then there is this rupture. That's why Darwin left his faith. That's why Nietzsche left his faith. So existentialism marks this rupture, that your rational faculty is not anymore accepting the theological dogma presented in the 7th century or 5th century or 6th century. But in India, there was this continuity in terms of empirical verification. Not because my guru tells me or book tells me I have to accept. I can verify it. All right. So existentialism has not arisen in Indian context because it was never our need. It was never our crisis to go to that extreme of debunking the transcendental value altogether. I hope it tried to come close to your expectation.
Yes, it was a pretty detailed answer. I suppose we are done for the day with the questions. So,
Yeah.
sir, I thank you formally on behalf of all the participants and the association.
Thank you all for giving
we
me this
hope-
opportunity to turn to this subject after so many years.
Yes, so we hope to have you again as the date is comfortable for you. All the participants, we would be meeting on 7th March now with the 40th lecture with the subject English language teaching in India. It would be delivered by Dr. Imran Khan. Time and link remains the same. Thank you all and good night.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dhwani. See you.